Hello, everyone. Today we'll be presenting on the Bussa Revolt or Barbados Rebellion of 1816. Here, you'll see a map of Barbados. The feast is placed in the parish of St. George, which is one of the many parishes that were active in the revolt. To the, to the left of St. George is Bridgetown, where many whites sought refuge during the uprising. By the end of this presentation, we hope you will be able to understand the various events of this revolt, namely the causes, organization, suppression, consequences, and the role of genders.
One major cause of the revolt was the Emancipation Rumors. In 1808, the slave trade had been abolished in the British West Indies. This forced planters to smuggle in slaves to replenish their labor force. Consequently, William Wilberforce was active in the passing of the Slave Registration Bill of 1815 to deter planters from smuggling slaves. This bill required the names and descriptions of slaves to be registered. Slaves misunderstood this action of the British Parliament and coupled with the planters' blatant opposition towards the bill. Slaves believed their freedom was on the way and revolted when freedom papers failed to arrive. Additionally, slaves wanted their freedom. The entire essence of being a slave in the Caribbean meant your freedom and livelihood were held captive by the plantocracy. They had to endure back-breaking work under deplorable conditions and had to endure physical and psychological abuse. According to Beckles and Shepard 2004, the Caribbean was a black people's grave. Barbados did in fact belong to the slaves, as it was their forced labor that turned the West Indies into a profitable gold mine. The Caribbean had quite literally been built on exploited slave labor. Hence, they opted to revolt than to subject themselves to this unfathomable experience of being a slave any longer. Many slaves like Washington Franklin and Nanny Grigg had their own personal grievances against the whites. They were educated and were able to fuel emancipation rumors and relay the information of the Haitian Revolution. Freedom of movement, able leaders, and ample time. The enslaved did not cease to take advantage of their opportunity. As aforementioned, slaves like Nanny Grigg had been spreading emancipation rumors and told the slaves that freedom was on the way. When they realized they were to be disappointed, they planned to revolt during the Easter weekend when most planters would have been away from the island. Also, able leaders such as Bussa and Cain Davis emerged, which gave the slaves the opportunity to meet and strategize a solid plan. This was done under the disguise of a dance, since in Barbados, at the time, slaves had a certain level of freedom, which allowed them to meet in weekend gatherings. Despite the fact the slaves' conditions were utterly deplorable, planters were overly confident that slaves were content with their situation and their system was secure. One planter was even reported to have slept with his chamber doors open on the night of the revolt.
Taking advantage of their freedom of movement under the disguise of a dance, the slave planned to strike during the Easter weekend when most planters would have been away. Slaves formed guerrilla groups to engage in the warfare with the militia, which would ensue, while others would burn plantation and destroy equipment. The rebels planned to follow in the footsteps of the Haitian freedom fighters to instill utter fear and compliance within the whites. Various leaders emerged to coordinate the revolt. John Grigg held various meetings to ignite the fighting spirits and, if necessary, resorted to the threatening of slaves to join the cause. Bussa, a well-respected and trusted leader, was able to encourage 400 enslaved men and women to fight for the cause. The rebels were also assisted in their cause by free colored men such as Cain Davis, who had even more freedom of movement. He was able to travel to various plantations across the island and spread the word of the attack in order to gain more support. Richard Sargent propagated rumors of emancipation and was effective in mobilizing an army.
Rebellion broke out on Sunday night due to the actions of a drunken slave spreading false information about the revolt. In just a few hours, bells were rung and other plantations joined in on the insurrectionary activity. However, the very next morning, the British sought to gain control of the rebellion and were successful in their attempt. On April 15th, the insurrectionary activities of the slaves were crushed by the swift action of Colonel Edward Codd. The guerrilla warfare tactics of the slaves were futile against the aggression of imperial troops and the militia, who were aided by the relatively flat terrain of the island. Martial law was implemented immediately, and within a week the rebellion was extinguished. Many slaves caught off estates were executed on the spot. As a result of the conflict, many of the rebels were killed and some later sentenced to death. Due to the implementation of martial law, public flogging was lawfully instituted, and out of fear, many rebels incriminated themselves and others. Many free coloreds even fought on the side of the oppressors in the West Indies Regiment.
The consequences of the revolt were numerous and life-threatening for some. The rebels were defeated and the confrontation ultimately caused a decline in the labor force and economic productivity. Plantations were burnt and equipment destroyed. One-fifth of the sugar crop was destroyed. In order to prove their dominance, the British exercised martial law in Barbados until July 13th. Humanitarians were even more inclined to strengthen the argument emancipation due to the atrocities and the fact that missionaries were blamed for inciting the rebellion. According to Michael Creighton, 1982, one part of the reason for this revolt was due to the actions of the missionaries. He said, slave revolts in the British West Indies were led by assimilated confidential slaves, many of whom were Christians, and slaves believed that they should be free since all men are born equal in the eyes of God.
The statistics of the revolt were atrocious, especially for the rebels in comparison to the oppressors. 1,000 blacks died during the course of the war. 144 were tried and executed afterwards. 123 slaves were deported to places such as Honduras and Sierra Leone. Notice how insignificant the oppressor casualties are in comparison to the freedom fighters. A single white man died, though some sources claimed it was two, and 2 soldiers of the West Indies Regiment died. This force consisted of colored persons. The total economic loss for planters as it relates to sugar was only £175,000.
Various revolts throughout Caribbean history have adopted the face of strong men whom have been accredited as inspiring and able leaders. The War of General Bussa is no exception. According to Adam Hochschild, Nanny Grigg is doubly written out of history. She was an educated domestic slave who assisted the rebels through her ability to read and was subsequently a vital organ in the orchestration of the infamous Bussa Revolt. She was able to obtain a wealth of information about emancipation proposals from local and British newspapers, which the planters desired to keep private. It has been speculated that her role as a senior domestic house slave, where she was valued at €130, afforded her literacy. According to court-martial testimonies from the revolt, Nanny was responsible for inciting insurrectionary ideas in the cane fields. As a woman living within the planters' walls, no slave or free-colored questioned her interpretation of the Registration Act. Hence, she was gasoline added to the fires of emancipation rumors.
According to Hochschild, one slave gave the account that Nanny said the negroes were all to be free on New Year's Day, and that they were all fools to work, for that she would not, as freedom they were sure to get. The enslaved had such belief in her that when this day passed and no such thing occurred, they followed her lead and waited for free papers on Easter Monday. Realizing they were yet to be disappointed, she instructed the slaves to fight for their freedom. Otherwise, they would not get it. She assured them that the Haitians would come to their rescue and, by their example, encourage aggression, saying the only way to gain freedom was to set fire, as that was the way they did it in Saint Domingue. In closing, we leave you with this quote. The only way to obtain freedom was to fight for it. Slave owners would never give up without a fight. Nanny Craig.
Sources used to gather information for these presentations include Beckles and Shepard 2004, Michael Creighton 1982, Ramon Foster 2021, Ronald Tree 1972, and Adam Hochschild 2005. Thanks for listening to our presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.